Hi, third graders. It's time for our next installment of the Voyage of the Dawn Treader. This is chapter 5, The Storm and What Came of It. If you'll remember, Caspian succeeded in finding Lord Byrne, the first of the 7 lords that had been sent away when he was a child after his father had died. He's on a quest to find either the lords themselves or what became of them. So they are now getting ready to leave the Lone Islands, which is the last known area of civilization. They've got the Dawn Treader full of food and fresh water and things that they'll need, and they're heading out for the unknown. It was nearly 3 weeks after their landing that the Dawn Treader was towed out of Narrowhaven Harbor. Very solemn farewells had been spoken, and a great crowd had assembled to see her departure. There had been cheers and tears, too, when Caspian made his last speech to the Lone Islanders and parted from the Duke and his family. But as the ship, her purple sail still flapping idly, drew further from the shore, and the sound of Caspian's trumpet from the poop deck came fainter across the water, everyone became silent. Then she came into the wind. The sails swelled out. The tug cast off and began rowing back. The first real wave ran under the Dawn Treader's prow, and she was a live ship again. The men off duty went below. Drinian took the first watch on the poop deck, and she turned her head eastward, south of Avra. The next few days were delightful. Lucy thought she was the most fortunate girl in the world. She woke up each morning to see the reflection of the sunlit water dancing on the ceiling of her cabin, and looked around at all the nice new things that she had gotten in the Lone Islands: sea boots and buskins and cloaks and jerkins and scarves. She would go up on deck and take a look from the forecastle at the sea, which was brighter blue each morning, and drink in the air that was a little warmer each day. After that came breakfast, and such an appetite as one only had at sea. She spent a good deal of time sitting on the little bench at the stern playing chess with Reepicheep. It was amusing to see him lifting the pieces, which were far too big for him, with both paws and standing on tiptoes, as if he made a move near the center of the board. He was a good player, and when he remembered what he was doing, he usually won. But every now and then, Lucy won because the mouse did something quite ridiculous, like sending a knight into the danger of the queen and castle combined. This happened because he had momentarily forgotten that it was a game of chess, and he was thinking of a real battle and making the knight do what he would certainly do in its place. For his mind was full of forlorn hopes, death or glory charges, and last stands. But this pleasant time did not last. Then there came an evening when Lucy, gazing idly astern at the long furrow or wake that was leaving behind them, saw a great rack of clouds building up itself in the west with amazing speed. Then a gap was torn in it, and yellow sunset poured through the gap. All the waves behind them seemed to take on unusual shapes, and the sea was drab or yellowish color like dirty canvas. The air grew cold. The ship began to move uneasily as if she felt the danger behind her. The sail would be flat and limp one minute and fully wild the next. While she was noticing these things and wondering if the sinister change would come over the very noise of the wind, Drinian cried, "All hands on deck!" In a moment, everyone became fanatically busy. The hatches were battened down, the galley fire was put out, men went aloft to reef the sail, means to draw it in so it doesn't get torn in the wind. Before they had finished, the storm struck them. It seemed to Lucy that a great valley of the sea opened up just before their bows and rushed down into it, deeper down than she would have believed possible. A great gray hill of water, far higher than the mast, rushed to meet them. It looked certain death, but they were tossed to the top of it. The ship seemed to spin around. A cataract of water poured over the deck. The poop deck and forecastle were like 2 islands with the fierce sea between them. Up aloft, the sailors were lying out along the yard, desperately trying to keep control of the sail. A broken rope stood sideways in the wind, as straight and stiff as a poker. "Get below, ma'am," bawled Drinian. Lucy, knowing that landsmen and landswomen are a nuisance to the crew, began to obey. It was not easy. The Dawn Treader was listing terribly to starboard, and the deck sloped like the roof of a house. She had to clamber around to the top of the ladder, holding on to the rail, and then stand by while 2 men climbed up it, and then down to get down as best she could. It was while she was holding on tight for the foot of the ladder. Um, at the foot of the ladder, another wave roared across the deck, up to her shoulders. She was already almost wet through with spray and rain, but this was colder. Then she made a dash for the cabin door and got in and shut out for a moment the appalling sight of the speed with which they were rushing into the dark. But not, of course, the horrible confusion of creakings, groanings, snappings, chatterings, roarings, and boomings, which only sounded more alarming below than they had up on the deck. All the next day, and the next one, it went on. It went on till one could hardly remember a time when it had begun. There had always been 3 men at the tiller, and it was as much as three could do to keep any kind of a course. Sorry, brief pause. And there had always been men at the pump, and there were hardly any rest for anyone, and nothing could be cooked, and nothing could be dried, and one man was lost overboard, and they never saw the sun. When it was over, Eustace made the following entry in his diary. Eustace, yeah. September 3rd, the first day for ages when I have been able to write. We have been driven before a hurricane for 13 days and nights. I know because I kept careful count, though the others say it was only 12. Pleasant to be embarked on a dangerous voyage with people who can't even count right. I have a ghastly time, up and down enormous waves, hour after hour, usually wet to the skin, and not even an attempt to be given us proper meals. Needless to say, there's no wireless, means a radio, or even a rocket, so no chance of signaling anyone for help. It all proves what I keep on telling them, the madness of setting out in a rotten little tub like this. It would be bad enough one was decent people instead of fiends in human form. Caspian and Edmund, simply brutal to me. The night we lost our mast, it's only a stump left now. Though I was not at all well, they forced me to come up on deck and work like a slave. Lucy shoved her oar in by saying that Reepicheep was longing to go up, only he was too small. I wonder she doesn't see that everything that little beast does is for the sake of showing off. Even at her age, she ought to have that amount of sense. Today, the beastly boat is level at last, and the sun's out, and we've all been jawing about what to do. We have food enough, pretty beastly stuff, most of it, to last for 16 days. The poultry were all washed overboard. Even if they hadn't been, the storm would have stopped them from laying eggs. The real trouble is water. 2 casks seem to have gotten a leak knocked into them and are empty. Narny efficiency again. On short rations, half a pint a day, we've got enough for 12 days. There's still lots of rum and wine, but even they realized that would only make them thirstier. If we could, of course, do the sensible thing, would be to turn west at once and make for the Lone Islands. But it took us 18 days to get where we are, running like mad with the gale behind us. Even if we got an east wind, it might take us far longer to get back. And at present, there's no sign of an east wind. In fact, there's no wind at all. As for rowing back, it would take far too long, and Caspian says the men couldn't row on half a pint of water a day. I'm pretty sure this is wrong. I tried to explain that perspiration really cools people down, so men would need less water if they were working. He didn't take any notice of this, which is always his way when he can't think of an answer. The others all voted for going on in the hope of finding land. I felt it my duty to point out that we didn't know there was any land ahead, and tried to get them to see the dangers of wishful thinking. Instead of producing a better plan, they had the cheek to ask me what I proposed. So I just explained coolly and quietly that I had been kidnapped and brought away on this idiotic voyage without my consent, and it was hardly any of my business to get them out of their scrape. September 4th, still becalmed. Very short rations for dinner, and I got less than anyone. Caspian's very clever at helping, and thinks that I don't see Lucy, for some reason tried to make it up to me by offering some of hers, but that interfering prig Edmund wouldn't let her. Pretty hot sun. Terribly thirsty all evening. September 5th. Still becalmed and very hot. Feeling rotten all day, and I'm sure I've got a temperature. Of course, they haven't the sense to keep a thermometer on board. September 6th. Horrible day. Woke up at night knowing I was feverish and must have a drink of water. Any doctor would have said so. Heaven knows that I'm the last person to try to get any unfair advantage, but I never dreamed that the water rationing would mean to apply to a sick man. In fact, I would have woken the others up and asked for some, only I thought that it would be selfish to wake them up. So I just got up and took my cup and tiptoed out of that black hole that we sleep in, taking great care not to disturb Caspian and Edmund, for they had been sleeping badly since the heat and the short water began. I always try to consider others when they're nice to me or not. I got out all right into the big room, if you can call it a room, where the rowing benches and the luggage are. The thing of water is at this end. All was going beautifully, but before I had drawn a cupful, who should catch me but that little spy, Reap. That's Reepicheep, of course. I tried to explain that I was going on deck for a breath of fresh air. Some business about the water had nothing to do with him, and he asked me why I had a cup. He made such a noise that the whole ship was roused. They treated me scandalously. I asked, as I think anyone would have, why Reepicheep was sneaking about the water cask in the middle of the night. He said that he was too small to be of any use on deck, so he did sentry over the water every night so that one more man could get to sleep. Now comes the rotten unfairness. They all believed him. Can you beat that? I had to apologize, or the dangerous little brute would have been at me with his sword. Then Caspian showed up with his true colors as a brutal tyrant and said out loud for everyone to hear that anyone found stealing water in the future would get 2 dozen. Don't know what that meant until Edmund explained it to me. It comes in a sort of books like those Pevensey kids read. After this cowardly threat, Caspian changed his tune and started being patronizing. He said he felt sorry for me and everyone felt just as feverish as I did, and we must all make the best of it, etc., etc. Odious stuck-up pig. Stayed in bed all day today. September 7th. A little wind today, but still from the west. Made a few miles eastward with part of the sail set on what Drinian calls the jury mast. It means the bowsprit set upright and tied, they call it lashed, to the stump of the real mast. Still terribly thirsty. So since the real mast was broken in the storm, they kind of had to rig something up to hold the sail so that they could move. September 8th. Still sailing east. I stay in my bunk all day now and see no one except Lucy till 2 fiends come to bed. Lucy gives me a little of her water ration. She says girls don't get as thirsty as boys. I often thought this, but it ought to be more generally known at sea. September 9th. Land in sight. Very high mountain, long way off to the southeast. September 10th. The mountain is bigger and clearer, but still a long way off. Gulls again today for the first time since I don't know how long. If you see seagulls, that means land is nearby. September 11th. Caught some fish and had them for dinner. Dropped anchor at about 7 p.m. in the fathoms of water at a bay of the mountainous island. That idiot Caspian wouldn't let us go ashore because it was getting dark. He was afraid of savages or wild beasts. Extra water ration tonight. What awaited them on the island was going to concern Eustace far more than anyone else, but it cannot be told in his words because after September 11th, he forgot about keeping a diary for a long time. When morning came, with low gray sky, but very hot, the adventurers found that they were in a bay encircled by such cliffs and crags that it was like a Norwegian fjord. In front of them, at the head of the bay, there was level land heavily overgrown with trees that appeared to be cedars, through which a rapid stream came out. Beyond that was a steep ascent, edging the jagged ridge from behind that vague darkness of mountains, which ran up into dull colored clouds so that you could see not even their tops. The nearer cliffs at each side of the bay were streaked here and there with lines of white which everyone knew to be waterfalls, though at a distance they would not show any movement or make any noise. Indeed, the whole place was very silent, and water of the bay was smooth as glass. It reflected every detail of the cliffs. The scene would have been a pretty enough picture, but it was rather oppressive in real life. It was not a country that welcomed visitors. The whole ship's company went ashore in 2 boatloads, and everyone drank and washed deliciously in the river, and had a meal and a rest before Caspian sent 4 men back to keep the ship, and the day's work began. There was everything to be done. The cask must be brought ashore, the faulty ones mended if possible, and all of them refilled. A tree, a pine if they could get it, must be felled and made into a new mast. Sails must be repaired, a hunting party organized to shoot any game the land might yield, clothes to be washed and mended, countless small breakages on board to be set right. For the Dawn Treader herself, and this was more obvious now that they saw her at a distance, could hardly be recognized as the same gallant ship which had left Narrowhaven. She looked a crippled, discolored hulk, which anyone might have taken for a wreck. And her officers and crew were no better, lean, pale, red-eyed from lack of sleep, and dressed in rags. As Eustace lay under a tree, he heard all these plans being discussed, and his heart sank. Was there going to be no rest? It looked as if their first day on the longed-for land was going to be as quite hard work as a day at sea. Then a delightful idea occurred to him. Nobody was looking. They were all chattering about the ship as if they actually liked the beastly thing. Why shouldn't he simply slip away? He would take a stroll inland, find a cool, airy place up in the mountains, have a good long sleep, and not rejoin the others until the day's work was over. He felt it would do him some good. He would take great care to keep the bay and the ship in sight, so he could be sure of his way back. He wouldn't like to be left behind in this country. He at once put his plan into action. He rose quietly from his place and walked along among the trees, taking care to go slowly, with an aimless manner, so that everyone who saw him would think that he was merely stretching his legs. He was surprised to find how quickly the noise of conversation died away behind him, and how very silent and warm and dark green the wood became. Soon he felt he could venture on quicker and more determined stride. This soon brought him out of the woods. The ground became sloping steeply up in front of him. The grass was dry and slippery, but manageable, if he used his hands as well as his feet. And though he panted and mopped his forehead a good deal, he plunged away steadily. This showed, by the way, that his new life, little as he suspected it, had already done him some good. The old Eustace, Harold and Alberta's Eustace, would have given up the climb after about 10 minutes. Slowly, and with several rests, he reached the ridge. Here he had expected to have a new view in the heart of the island, but the clouds had now come lower and nearer to the sea, and a fog was rolling in to meet him. He sat down and looked back. He was now so high the bay looked beneath him. Miles and miles and miles of sea were visible. Then the fog from the mountains closed in all around him, thick but not cold, and he lay down and turned this way and that to find the most comfortable position to enjoy himself. But he didn't enjoy himself, not for very long. He began, almost for the first time in his life, to feel lonely. At first the feeling grew very gradually. Then he began to worry about the time. There was not the slightest sound. Suddenly, if it occurred to him that he might be lying there for hours, perhaps the others had gone. Perhaps they had left him to wander away on purpose, simply in order to leave him behind. He leapt up in a panic and began his descent. At first he tried to do it quickly, slipping on the steep grass, and slid for several feet. Then he thought that it had carried him too far to the left. As he came up, he had seen the precipices on that side, so he clambered up again, and near as he could guess to the place where he had started from, and began his descent afresh, bearing to his right. After that, things seemed to be going better. He went very cautiously, but he could not see any more than a yard ahead. There was still perfect silence all around him. It's very unpleasant to go cautiously when there's a voice inside you all the time saying, "Hurry, hurry, hurry!" Every moment, the terrible idea of being left behind grew stronger. As if he understood, Caspian and the Pevensies would have known, of course, that they were not the least chance of doing such things. But he had persuaded himself that they were all fiends in human form. So he was afraid they would leave him, but had they known, they wouldn't have left him. "At last," said Eustace, when he came slithering down the slide of loose stones, scree they call it, and found himself on the level. "And now, where are those trees? There is something dark ahead. Why, I do believe the fog is clearing." It was. The light increased every moment and made him blink. The fog lifted. He was in an utterly unknown valley, and the sea was nowhere in sight. So Eustace is now officially lost. The next chapter is The Adventures of Eustace. You're going to love the next chapter. Have a good one, guys. I love you.